We're really blessed to have in this panel not just folks that discover drugs, folks that detect neurological disorders, but also we have some patient advocates and or NFL players. So I got to make sure that I say the right thing or I'm going to get tackled up here. I know that for sure. But I'm really pleased to introduce our first speaker, mainly because I am an Ohio State Buckeye, like there's none other. And by the way, we're going to have Buckeyes in the back at lunchtime. You guys can take their good luck charms. So they're going to be in the back. The first speaker we have is a Hall of Fame Ohio State Buckeye, free safety, played with Archie Griffin. He then went on, played with the Patriots, and from the Patriots went on to play with San Diego Chargers, and then finally the Los Angeles Rams. Free safety, incredible guy, been a friend for quite a number of years, Tim Fox. I'll take it back.
Thank you very much. And it is the Ohio State University, by the way, not Ohio State. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a little nerve-wracking, though. If I'm you sitting out there in the audience, I'd wonder, well, what's this guy that has memory issues going to come up and say? And I'm not really sure what that's going to be, frankly. But the good news is I do not have a PowerPoint presentation, so you will not have to follow along with that. But you heard a little bit of my background. I started playing football when I was 12 years old. So I went through, let's see, what would that be? That would be about 24 years of getting hit in the head playing football. So, the game is changing, thankfully. It's changing. But, in my 24 years of football, I can sit here and think, okay, I broke both arms. I broke my wrist 3 times. I've had 3 ankle surgeries. I've had a hip replaced. I've had a knee replaced. I've had a shoulder rebuilt. I fractured vertebrae in my neck. Did I go over both of the broken arms? Okay, good. So, but the reality is I'm not here to, I'm not speaking to a bunch of orthopedic surgeons here. So we're here to talk about head trauma. At least I'm here to talk about head trauma. And I will tell you that it is something that's near and dear to my heart. I've worked the last, after getting out of football, I've worked the last 24 years for a company called R.R. Donnelley Financial. And it's been a great. Actually, Peter Cronin originally hired me into that industry, and so we've been friends a long time. As of a week ago Friday, I retired from that industry, and a lot of that is due. The retirement issue is due to my inability to remember things, and it is problematic, and it has been a good run, but I finally got to the point where I was putting an undue stress upon the people that work around me, my administrative assistants, the other sales reps, in terms of getting to appointments and getting quotes out and getting things out, because in the financial printing industry, for those of you that are unfamiliar with it, we help companies file with the Securities and Exchange Commission. We help them communicate with their shareholders. We help them register with the Securities and Exchange Commission with the initial public offerings. And if you're not available in 5 minutes, it's going to be a problem. So as a result of the many head injuries I've had throughout my career, it became just too difficult to fathom. So I am available for consulting work. It's going to happen. Going to have to be pretty easy, and you're going to have to give me a really good associate that will help make sure I'm there at the right time. But just in terms of this is a very, very important to me that we pay attention to head injury in sports. We're seeing more and more in the NFL trying to move away from that, but the reality is I'm very concerned. I think there's going to be an epidemic in what Bob Stern will talk to you later on with CTE, in players of my generation. Because when you think about it, even players that are 10 years older than me, I'm 62. So if someone who played is 72 to 75 and you say, yeah, well, they played football and they would be susceptible to the same injuries. But the reality is those guys didn't start when they were 11 or 12 years old in Pop Warner. And if they did, those guys started in junior high school and they were actually wearing helmets. They could have been leather helmets, or they were without face masks. And it wasn't until they got into the high school level and sometimes even the college level when they actually put a face mask on a helmet. Where players of my era and Pete's era, we started Pop Warner at the age of 11 or 12, and we had helmets with face masks, hard plastic helmets. And the reality is we were taught to tackle and to play with our heads. We were taught to put your helmet between the numbers of the guy that's carrying the ball, and that's how you took him down. Or if you could put your helmet on the ball, you'd take him down. The reality is when we moved into the NFL, obviously injuries are always going to be a problem. You know, I understand, and you know, so when I talk about all the injuries I've had, those have all, to a certain degree, been corrected. You know, there are medical answers for those, and the solutions are pretty good. The problem with the head injuries today is that there is not a solution for that. And so I'm afraid that you're going to start to see guys my age that have been using their head to hit people for 24 years, that you're going to start seeing this epidemic of people with these memory issues. And we're already seeing it, and Bob will speak to it more later. But so what I want to see, and for those of you that are specializing in neurology out there, I'm looking for two things. First of all, I think you need to figure out a way to scientifically diagnose when someone has had a concussion. You cannot leave that decision up to the players, because when the player gets knocked out or gets dinged, he's going to come to the sidelines. He's going to find his buddy who plays offense or defense opposite him, and he's going to sit beside him on the bench. And when they start asking you questions and you don't have a question you can answer, this guy's going to whisper in your ear and give you the answer, and then you're going to tell it to the doctor, and then they're going to let you go back in. You know, I often say that in the NFL particular, the only difference between good players and great players is opportunity. And so as a player, if you're in there and you're starting, and this is your livelihood, and you get a ding in the head, you cannot afford to miss time. Because if you miss time and that guy comes in and all of a sudden the quarterback throws an interception right to him, he looks like a great player. And if that happens again, he looks like a better player. And all of a sudden, you know, you're sitting behind him, and then the next year you're out of a job. And you got to figure out a way to take care of your family. So you cannot leave that decision up to the players sitting on the bench, because they will always make the wrong decision, always. And then secondly, we need to start moving, we need to figure out a way to diagnose players that have issues from the past. And that would certainly be me. And again, Bob is going to speak to this. He's been a pioneer in this. He's proud of the fact that the NFL hates him because he and Dr. Cantu and I forget.
And McKee.
Who?
Dr. McKee.
Dr. McKee, yes. See, there you go. I couldn't remember that. Dr. McKee were the most important people in this research, and they brought it to the forefront, and it's created a real problem for the NFL. So we need to figure out a way to diagnose it. We need to find it before you're dead, and we need to find a way to treat it. And so that falls directly on you folks out there. So thank you very much. Thanks for coming.
Thank you very much, Tim, The Ohio State University. I would like now to introduce Bob Stern. Dr. Stern is a professor of neurology and neurosurgery and anatomy and neurobiology at Boston University School of Medicine, where he is also director of the clinical core of the NIA-funded BU Alzheimer's Disease and CTE Center. A major focus of his research involves the long-term effects, the repetitive head impacts in athletes, including the neurodegenerative disease chronic traumatic encephalopathy. He is the lead investigator of the recently awarded $16 million NIH grant for the multi-center study to develop methods of diagnosing CTE during the life, including fluid biomarkers, neuroimaging, as well as examining potential risk factors of the disease, including genetic and head exposure. Dr. Stern's been working with us for a few years, and I've gotten to know him very well. His work is his passion, and what he can do for this world and the suffering that so many people are going through is just extraordinary. So Without any further ado, Dr. Stearns.
Kevin, thank you. It's really an honor to be here, truly an honor. I feel very out of my league being surrounded by so many world-class scientists, but it's wonderful to be able to participate. It's also great to be able to come right after Tim Fox, who I have known for many years and admired, and I'm thrilled that you're able to articulate what we need right now so beautifully. So let me just start by going over those disclosures just to let you know where some of my funding comes from directly to me. But let's just start with what Tim was talking about. All right, you get it, right? You get it. And what has been great is that over the last few years, there have been tremendous strides in the awareness, prevention, and dealing with the management of concussions. Concussions being those hits that result in symptoms. Huge strides in that. This is one of them. There's another in terms of management, when you can go back in. I got to tell you, though, another disclosure. I actually don't know much about concussions. I'm actually a neurodegenerative disease researcher. I mostly focus on Alzheimer's disease the rest of my career. And I actually am not that concerned about concussions. I'm really not. When it comes to the later life neurodegenerative diseases. Stay tuned, I'll clarify that a little bit later. What I'm more concerned about are what we refer to as repetitive head impacts. So if we think of that proverbial iceberg, the concussions, which are symptomatic, mild traumatic brain injuries, are at the top of the iceberg, that little teeny amount that you can see. What we're more concerned about are what is referred to sometimes as subconcussive trauma. And this is when there's an impact to the brain with adequate force to have some effect on neuronal integrity, but with no immediate symptoms, no concussion. There are some sports, some positions that are very prone to this. Think of a football lineman. Every play of every game of every practice, they're down like this. What do? They hit their heads against their opponent. Tim was pointing out earlier, it doesn't need to be that head-to-head stuff that can result in these types of subconcussive hits. Every time you hit your body against someone or against the ground and your brain moves around, you may not have symptoms, but something might be going on. There's now lots of evidence growing all the time that even a single season of these types of subconcussive hits, as measured by accelerometers in football helmets, can lead to a whole bunch of changes just after a single season. Structural changes to the brain, physiological, cognitive impairment. But the question now for me is, what about the long-term consequences of getting your head hit over and over again? And so we've known about that sport for a long time, actually. Back in 1928, there was a wonderful article in JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, called Punch Drunk, referring to the long-term consequences of getting your head hit in boxing. Since then, the term traumatic encephalopathy started in 1934, dementia pugilistica, a lot of you have heard about in 1937, but the term CTE, chronic traumatic encephalopathy, has actually been around for a long time, since the 1950s, maybe even 1940. But it wasn't until a football player, who you saw earlier in the video, Mike Webster, an American football player, an NFL star, was diagnosed after he died with this disease that our culture started becoming aware of it, started paying attention to it. So what is it? Let's just get to what we do know. CT is a neurodegenerative disease. It's similar to Alzheimer's disease and frontotemporal lobar degeneration, both of which are referred to as tauopathies. I'll describe that in a minute. But CTE is a unique disease, neuropathologically, as well as the initial mechanism of disease and risk factors. It's associated with a history of repetitive brain trauma, including concussions, but also those subconcussive hits. And that history of repetitive head impacts seems to put in motion a cascade of events in the brain that eventually leads to a progressive neurodegeneration. It's not a prolonged post-concussion syndrome. It's not like someone gets badly hit and they're impaired and that just goes on and on and on. It's not the cumulative effect of an injury, an injury, an injury, and you keep getting worse and worse and there's more brain damage. It's actually not a brain injury per se. It's not a traumatic brain injury. It is a disease, again, similar to Alzheimer's. And it seems to appear earlier in life, perhaps when someone is in the middle of getting their head hit. But the symptoms of the disease, the clinical presentation, doesn't begin until years or decades after the brain trauma, and then they continue to worsen. And that clinical presentation includes things like changes in mood, depression, apathy, changes in behavior, aggression, rage, poor impulse control, cognitive impairment, memory difficulties, judgment. In some cases, especially in boxers, motor difficulties, Parkinsonism. And then it seems that if you live long enough with it, eventually there'll be dementia, meaning there's the cognitive impairments that get in the way of daily life. And like Alzheimer's disease and other neurodegenerative diseases, even right now in 2016, and that's one of the reasons why we're here, we can't really diagnose it while someone's alive. We're getting closer. Anne McKee published this paper in Brain a few years ago where we described the neuropathology initially of a large cohort of deceased individuals with CTE. To know it, to talk about what the rest of this talks about, I need to describe tau protein, referred to as microtubule-associated protein tau. In every neuron, we need to have this protein. When it's good, it's great. What it does is it holds together. It's the kind of the skeletal building block of microtubules, which are in every axon carrying information from one cell to another. But for some reason, in a variety of diseases, including CTE, that protein becomes misfolded, hyperphosphorylated. It falls off of that microtubule, allowing the microtubule to basically disintegrate. And in that new state, it starts to aggregate, forming what are referred to as neurofibrillary tangles. And so what we now know about the neuropathology of CTE is that it's characterized by an abundance of this misfolded hyperphosphorylated tau, or p-tau, in the way of neurofibrillary tangles as well as astrocytic tangles. And right now, there's an agreed-upon pathognomonic description of CTE neuropathology. It starts with an early perivascular distribution of this abnormal tau, and at the depths of the cortical sulci. I'll show you a picture in a minute. And then after that initial stage, it seems to then spread to the rest of the brain, resulting in progressive neuronal injury, cell death, eventual cortical atrophy, white matter degeneration as well, and all the symptoms that come with all of that. Here's just a picture under a microscope. The brown is stained for this abnormal tau. The thing in the middle is a blood vessel. And so this is that perivascular distribution of this abnormal tau that you don't see in any other condition. This is the cortical sulcus, the valley of the brain. And here around it is this aggregation of the abnormal tau. On the left is not under a microscope. That's just a slice of a brain where you see this buildup of the tau early on in the course, just at the depths of those cortical sulci. But later on, it takes over the entire brain and destroys it. All right, so we know that. And those pictures have painted 1,000 words, really. It's had this huge impact on society. Our group and others have been on the covers of all these magazines. Yeah, I got to be on 60 Minutes. It was very cool. But science doesn't move that quickly. And so over these last 10 years or so, there has been this increased awareness in culture, but the science in the best of times, in the best of funding, can't move that quickly. And so I've been saying that we're still in the infancy of our knowledge of CTE, but actually I think we're now in the toddlerhood, where we know a little bit more. I want to address something that Tim raised. I wasn't going to bring this in, but since he brought it up, I need to talk about it. Why is it that we haven't really talked about, seen CTE? Why hasn't it been a big deal in science, in neurology for a long time? Well, because it wasn't until around the 1950s that boxers started putting big padded gloves on in order to prevent injuries to their hands. And that resulted in the ability to hit over and over again one's opponent's head. And it wasn't, like Tim was saying, until the 1950s and 60s that these hard plastic helmets with face masks started to be used. And it wasn't until the late 1960s and early 70s that Pop Warner football became a national thing, and our youth started to hit their heads over and over again. They're 7 years old. And so you have to think about where we are now in our society. Those first individuals who played college football with hard plastic helmets and face masks, they're only in their mid-70s. I'm not talking about pros, just people who played college ball. The first individuals who started playing tackle football before high school are only in their late 50s and 60s now, like Tim was saying. So if you think about the entire history of humankind, we've been around for around 200,000 years. It's just this tiny little blip of the last 50 to 75 years that human beings have been hitting their heads over and over again and putting their kids on a field and say, you hit your head over and over again. And so we just have no idea what lies ahead. We really don't have an idea. I don't know if it's going to be a big deal or not. And so we need to know some very important things about this disease, like, is it common? Is it a big deal? Well, in our brain bank that Dr. McKee runs, yes, indeed, it's been discussed in the media that 90 out of 94 pro football players whose brains have been examined have had CTE. Well, that's not how you do epidemiology. It's a biased brain bank. More recently, there was a less biased brain bank, just an overall neurodegenerative disease brain bank at the Mayo Clinic, where they published a major paper, and they specifically looked at the relationship between playing contact sports, amateur contact sports, and CT pathology in the brain. And they found that around 1/3 of men who had a history of playing predominantly football, amateur football, high school, college, had CT pathology. But even that's not it. We need to do longitudinal research with large sample sizes. And part of that is to also figure out why some people get it and some people don't. There's one thing we do know, that all neuropathologically confirmed cases of CTE to date have had one thing in common, and that's a history of repetitive head impacts. In other words, that repetitive impact to the brain is a necessary factor, but not a sufficient factor to develop this disease. In other words, not everyone who hits their head over and over again is going to get it. And so we need to figure out the risk factors. Are there genetics involved? Are there susceptibility genes? Well, the ApoE4 allele, like it does in so many conditions of aging, does seem to increase the risk for CT, but there's still much more to look at. But then comes the exposure. What is it about exposure? Is it the severity and the type of trauma? Is it maybe just getting enough time in between the hits to clear out the bad toxic stuff? Or is it the age of first exposure? We've done some studies that have shown that people who started hitting their heads in football before age 12 are worse both cognitively and also in terms of alterations of their corpus callosum compared to guys who started playing at age 12 or later. Is it the overall duration that someone plays? Or is it just the cumulative number of hits? And so to answer these questions, we do have to do what Tim asked us for, which is to diagnose CTE during life. Just like we've been doing so much better with other neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's disease. And if we could truly get pretty accurate with CTE, we'd be able to distinguish CTE from other causes of cognitive and behavioral change, including Alzheimer's, FTLD, even post-traumatic stress disorder, or the persistent and chronic sequelae of getting your head hit and having a concussion or a mild traumatic brain injury. We'd be able to understand the true incidence and prevalence of the disease, and we'd be able to look at the risk factors that I mentioned. But most importantly, we'd be able to start clinical trials for treatment and prevention of this disease. And so we need to be able to diagnose it during life. So what are the steps required? Well, number one might be just to describe it clinically. What is the clinical phenotype? We started to do that. What about developing provisional diagnostic criteria so we can see maybe who might fit in for research studies at least? We've started to do that. But then comes the big one, developing in vivo biomarkers that will be able to perhaps be a little more helpful and important than this one. As Kevin said much more eloquently this morning, the brain is the only part of the body that doesn't have a test for it. That's because of the blood-brain barrier that is there to predominantly keep bad things from coming into the brain. But it also keeps important things from the brain going into the circulatory system, at least in an amount and abundance that could be measured. And so how do we create biomarkers for this disease? Well, the first thing that everyone here who develops biomarkers knows, you have to develop a really good acronym. And so the first study we did was this is my Nobel Prize winning acronym. Kevin, you're right, I do great stuff. I can develop wonderful acronyms. It had a more complex name. It was an NIH grant that was there to help develop all of this stuff. And what we did over a few years was we brought into Boston around 100 former NFL players between the ages of 40 and 69. They all had to have some kind of symptoms. We chose people who played the positions with the greatest number of hits. We wanted to have a group of people who were at high risk for having this disease. And then we wanted a control group who did not have that known necessary variable for it, meaning any contact sports, any traumatic brain injury, military, where they might have gotten their head hit. We finished almost a year ago collecting all the data. We collected all kinds of stuff. These guys went through 2 or 3 days of intense assessments with all kinds of neuroimaging with my fabulous colleagues at Brigham and Women's Hospital. They all had lumbar punctures for us to measure proteins and other compounds in blood. We did extensive clinical exams. But when we started this thing, there wasn't anything on the horizon to measure tau in blood or to have a picture of tau in the brain. It just wasn't there. So we had to use, for example, all of these imaging techniques to measure these types of outcomes. The problem is that none of those were specific to CTE because none of those can really detect the abnormal tau. And imaging sometimes comes up with crazy results that you have to talk to the patient about. I have to show that. It's just one of my favorite slides. I'm sorry. And so what we really need then is a gold standard for the diagnosis of this disease that might separate it from others, and that gold standard would be able to see and measure the amount of this tau in the brain while someone's alive. And the use of PET imaging would be the place to do it. Unfortunately, it's just over the last 4 or 5 years that several groups around the world have been developing radiotracers, ligands that attach to specific isoforms of tau and not bind to other proteins associated with other diseases. And these have now been used successfully in many studies, predominantly of Alzheimer's disease and other tauopathies, and we started then using it to see if we can detect the abnormal tau in folks with a potential risk for having CTE. So we added it to that DETECT study and did both this new tau PET ligand as well as an already FDA-approved amyloid ligand to help rule out Alzheimer's disease as the cause of problems. We did that with 20 former NFL players and 10 controls. And so I'm just going to show you some very preliminary findings. These are not published yet. We're in the midst of putting together a much larger group. But for now, just to give you an idea, this is a subject who had no abnormal amyloid in the brain, but everything that you see that's lighting up, those bright spots, are abnormal tau. Give you a better idea of this coronal slice. If you look at that picture I showed you before of the neuropathology, it looks like that tau deposit is in the depths of the cortical sulci. So we may be on to something. But PET scans are not going to be the answer for large-scale screening. They're invasive, they have radiation exposure, they take a lot of time, they're really expensive for the most part, and so they're not necessarily going to be a first-round test. So what's needed is some kind of blood test. It can be done in the doctor's office or in a lab, and then come back with something that's meaningful. And so having a blood-based biomarker for CT is really an important thing to do. Because if we could detect tau in that routine blood test, that could then serve as a screen. And if it's positive, go on to more kind of focused tests. So for example, if we had an initial blood screening test that, like was described earlier, could be done, like the PSA has been done, and other blood screening tests in your annual physical that had really good high sensitivity, that might then lead to another blood test perhaps, a panel, a multiplex type of panel that could detect something that would say, yeah, you know, this person looks like they may have something that's worth going even further. Then look at neurodegeneration, changes in white matter, specific structural changes, perhaps measures of inflammatory response with neuroimaging, and then eventually try to figure out, does the person seem to have the tau deposition where you'd expect it? So one of the things that I've been working on is trying to figure out if we can look at that abnormal tau in a blood test, but try to see if it comes from the brain. Not just a blood test where you're measuring a low abundance amount of protein, but to see if we can actually measure something from the brain. Many of you here are familiar with exosomes. They're cell-derived nanovesicles, little vesicles that are let go from every type of cell in the body. They're found in all fluids. They mirror the internal cargo of the parent cell, and that's really important. They've been used in oncology for a long time as tumor-secreted exosomes, as tumor markers. One thing that's great is that they are very stable, and they go to that liquid biopsy that Kevin was talking about earlier. And one of the great things is that it seems that they cross the blood-brain barrier relatively freely. So here's my attempt at being graphically capable. This is inside a cell, a neuron. This is extracellular space. Here's that phosphorylated tau. It gets engulfed in an endosome inside the neuron. Those endosomes then are released, the internal, what are now called exosomes, are released out into the extracellular space. Then they indeed cross the blood-brain barrier. They can then be found in plasma, isolated from plasma, and voila, you have a nice publication. If only that were so easy. And we did publish this past year, an initial study of trying to do this in that DETECT study cohort, where we had 78 former NFL players and 16 controls. And indeed, the NFL group had higher amounts of this exosomal tau than the control group. It was pretty good sensitivity, 100% specificity, which is what we would hope for, because no one in the control group should have it, but not everyone in the NFL group should have it. And then came this. We found that there was this pretty strong correlation between the exosomal tau in plasma and cognitive functioning across a variety of neuropsychological tests. So that was really cool, but it's very, very preliminary. We need to do it the right way. That was done in a very kind of, general way. We really don't know for sure whether it was exosomes from the brain. We think they were. We don't know for sure what specific tau isoform we were looking at. Is it the same type that's seen in CTE? So there's a lot of work that we're going to be doing, others are already doing, to take this to the next step. But it will always require these extra steps. It won't be the kind of thing that will be immediately able to be done in, let's say, a Simoa platform where you can use digital biomarker technology to quickly do it, because you have to isolate those exosomes. And so there seems to also then be a need for direct measures of tau in the blood. A starting point for us was total tau. And so we did collaborate with the folks at Quanterix with a study that is now under review. So I'm telling you this prematurely, but it's kind of cool. And what we did was we focused on the relationship between that exposure to lots of hits in the brain and later life plasma total tau in former NFL players. So again, this was from DETECT, 96 former players, 25 controls. We looked at total tau because that's the most advanced of the tau assays that can be done with Simoa right now. But total tau seems to be a measure more of overall neuronal injury and not specific to the phosphorylated tau, the specific type of tau isoforms that may be indicative of this disease in particular. But it's a starting point. And then we looked at cumulative head index. We've created and published on this a model of how many hits someone might have gotten throughout their life by looking at how many seasons they played, at what position, at what level of play, using accelerometer data that's published out there to give us an estimated number of hits. And then they all had clinical examinations as well. And what we found was that there was no overall significant difference between the former NFL players and the controls, but the NFL players exhibited a much greater kind of an extreme variability in their total tau concentrations, with 12 of them having a total tau greater than 3.56. No control had that type of level. And if we use that type of cutoff, great specificity, lousy sensitivity, for the reasons I mentioned before. So there's no relationship also between the plasma tau and clinical measures in this sample. But here's the striking thing. We found a pretty robust relationship between the cumulative head impact exposure and total tau through this simple blood test. And so we need to know that, again, plasma tau is more of a general marker of neuronal injury. So what we need are plasma phosphorylated tau antibodies that are more specific to the tauopathies. And so we're now doing that. Colleagues in Sweden who are real leaders in this, and they're using the Simoa HD1 technology, are looking at a variety of potential biomarkers for this. All right, so then what? How do we move it forward? How do we refine and validate these biomarkers as we're getting them? You do another acronym. It's not as good. Diagnose CTE, you can see what it kind of stands for, but this was that grant that Kevin was talking about. We were fortunate enough to get a very large grant from NIH. I've got the best co-principal investigators around, Jeff Cummings, Eric Ryman, Marty Shenton. We also have 50 collaborators from 10 different research institutions from around the country, where we're going to be trying to do a whole lot of things to move this whole field forward. But let's talk about what the real future research is. Once we can really understand these biomarkers, once we can diagnose CTE during life, then we'll be able to begin clinical trials for treatment. And like Alzheimer's disease, if we can detect it early enough, begin treatments that are going to be disease-modifying, we can actually prevent the symptoms from ever happening. And so an important starting place is the ability to objectively measure and detect those initial concussions and subconcussive hits. So Tim, that is a big goal. We have to use the technology that's available now that will be discussed later in one of the talks and that's been really moved ahead to measure traumatic brain injury, sports-related concussions, and hopefully even these subconcussive trauma by new digital biomarkers. And so I guess I do care after all about that stuff. So stay tuned for Drs. Gill and Wellington's talks later. So I just want to end with this. If we're talking about precision health, let's bring CTE in as an exemplar. And so if you look at this graph, up here is where the disease might start sometime after getting or during getting these concussions and subconcussive hits, and it progressively moves on until death. And along the way, there's this point in time where there are no symptoms, but the disease is there, akin to what we look at in Alzheimer's disease. With preclinical Alzheimer's disease, the disease has started inside the brain, but there's no symptoms yet, until there's enough changes to the brain structure and functioning to have some type of symptoms, but maybe not yet bad enough to be called dementia, and then eventually CTE dementia. So, if we start at the top, and we have perhaps a multiplex panel of tests, of biomarkers for early injury, that will be wonderful because we can do things like reduce the overall exposure on an individual basis. We might be able to just say, okay, this person just had this, let's remove them from the game. Let's help make decisions for coming back to play or perhaps retirement from the sport. But then we could also start using new pharmacologic interventions, hopefully that will be around to clear the toxic proteins, perhaps inhibit glial activation and other inflammatory and neuroimmune responses. Then once the disease starts, after those hits, we want to still be able to have some kind of biomarker for injury, the inflammatory responses, perhaps even things like total tau and other measures of injury. And then we can start perhaps moving to the neuroimaging and eventually the PET tau. Those decisions could help make decisions for retirement from sport. We can then start new technologies, new compounds to alter what's going on in the brain, to slow down what might be devastating to the brain. Hopefully new compounds that are going to inhibit the production of this abnormal form of tau. And then as the person becomes symptomatic, a greater depth of biomarker panels, neuroimaging, PETs, to be able to then launch new compounds that instead of just preventing the abnormal tau from developing, to remove it. And then finally, when someone's demented, similar types of approaches to the testing. And then again, use anti-tau antibodies perhaps to slow it from further worsening, and then hopefully new symptomatic treatments. And if none of this works, then perhaps this approach might be, if you can't read it in the back, it says, I read that story about dementia and former NFL players. Maybe we should reconsider this. And I just want to thank a whole lot of wonderful people who do the real work, and I just get to show cartoons. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Tom. And we have a panel. 3 folks from the panel have not had a chance to introduce themselves yet. I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves. First, we have Pete Cronin, who is somebody that's a personal friend of mine. And over the years, I'll just tell you one quick story and let him say a few words. I got to know him because our daughters played soccer together and other sports. And I heard he played for the Redskins, so I was down in a taxi in Washington, D.C. when I said to the taxi driver, hey, you ever hear of a guy named Cronin? Guy stops the cab, turns around and says, holy smokes, Cronin the Barbarian? That guy's nuts. Pete, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Kevin. I'm going to only take about 45 minutes in my introduction here, but no, self-introduction, everything that's already been said, I do not want to reiterate. I only played 17 years of organized football, concussion, high-impact football, and to kind of validate Tim's messaging, we were taught, I was a defensive lineman, I was in one of those high-impact positions. Tim, a little bit different. Defensive backs didn't bang every day. They had some degree of it, but I was playing either defensive line or a linebacker. I hit every play. So I had repetitive impact hundreds of times a day over many, many years. I also had several what we call a Class B concussions with memory loss and so forth. But my story is we were taught in college to actually use our heads as the primary battering ram, as the primary point of contact. We'd read the head and push through, and just it was a great technique because most offensive linemen didn't like getting hit in the head with another helmet with about 250 pounds behind it. We were basically battering rams. That was the technique we were using. But fast forward, recently I went through a a series of tests just to kind of baseline my condition, my neurological condition. Several years ago, the doctor did a series of tests, nothing as thorough as Dr. Stern's, but he said, come on, get a cup of coffee, come back, and I'll tell you what I found out. And he says, I got some bad news, I got some good news, I got some bad news. I said, okay, what's the bad news? He says, you definitely have cognitive impairment. And I said, could you be more specific? And he went into some of the detail. And I said, so, okay, and what's the good news? He said, well, the good news is, you've developed a skill set to mitigate those symptoms because I'm undiagnosed ADD, and I learned when I got out of football, I need to get really organized. And the Timberland test, I used to write everything down, like even when I was in a sleep. But these are skills that I had developed over the years have mitigated the onslaught of these cognitive impairment things. So I says, well, what's if that's the bad news, what's the good news? He goes, the good news is you're no more cognitively impaired than anyone else your age. So then I said, then what's the bad news? He says, Pete, there's a lot of brain disease out there. We don't know what you did as a young man, what kind of impact it's going to have on your later stage life. Is it an accelerator? If not, what is it going to be? So I get very selfish about what Kevin's doing. This is not necessarily about, I see athletics as the tip of the spear. It's the thing that's drawing the attention to a much broader issue, and the ability for all of us in this room to have the opportunity that if we are predisposed to brain disease, we know about it early enough to do something about it, especially around the quality of life. So I encourage you all to consider the research, and I think we'll all be beneficiaries of the great strides you eventually make. Thank you.
Thanks, Pete. We thought it'd be also very important, and the next panelist has got this unique combination. He's both a neurologist but also a major investor. He's actually been involved with some of the biggest investments into Alzheimer's pharmaceutics in really the history of the biotech industry. So I'd like to ask Doug if he could make an introduction of himself and maybe provide some comments around why he got into the field he got into, and if he could just give some perspective, because this panel is really going to shift now from CTE to also Alzheimer's and other neurodegenerative diseases where there's drugs being invented and there's early detection techniques being deployed. So, Doug?
Thanks, Kevin. So I'll make a couple of comments that are partly reflective of my background as a neurologist and partly as somebody who invests and starts biotech companies. What I would start with is to ask everybody in the room just to imagine for a moment that we actually had all of the answers to some of these awful diseases such as CTE or Alzheimer's disease. That we actually understood exactly what was going on with people who were getting these diseases, what the different subtypes of these diseases were, how to intervene, and how to prevent. That's a future that right now we can only imagine, but it is absolutely worth us working towards. And I don't think that anybody would deny that. So we've been hearing a lot today about some of the challenges and the nascent state of some of our understanding of CTE, and that applies to Alzheimer's as well. But that shouldn't daunt us from trying to solve these problems because we need it as a society. So I think that if you look at the history of therapeutics in general, of diseases, the one lesson that is repeated over and over and over again is that when it starts to become possible to understand a disease, it starts to become possible to treat and to prevent the disease. And that until that happens, you're essentially flying blind. So in the field of neurological diseases in general, I would say that largely, with a couple of exceptions, up until now, we've really been flying blind. We know that these are severely impairing people, causing untold amounts of suffering for them, for their family, economic consequences, depression, etc. But we simply have not had sufficiently powerful tools to get the answers to the questions, what is going on here? Kevin mentioned that we've recently made a very big commitment to finance a company getting started to address neurodegenerative diseases such as Alzheimer's disease. And that's the first time that we've done this in the 16 years that I've been with Flagship. And it's a reflection of the fact that I and number of the people with whom I work believe that just now the tools are starting to become available to answer the key questions. Some of those tools have to do with imaging, and Bob referred to how that may play out in CTE. Some of them have to do with being able to engineer cells to create appropriate models. Some of them have to do with new therapeutic modalities, and some of them have to do with being able to analyze what's going on in the body, both centrally and peripherally, such as what Quanterix is doing. So I believe that where we are in neurology is roughly where we were in cancer about 20 years ago. And I mean that as a very hopeful statement, because about 20 years ago, the landscape in cancer started to change dramatically. And although we have a long, long way to go to treat many cancers, increasingly we can give hope to patients who come in and are told by their doctor that that's the diagnosis that they have. So neurology is getting on that same trajectory, and I'm very confident that over the next 5, 10, 20 years, we're going to be able to live up to the challenge that Tim posed, and we're going to actually be able to give real hope to the people who worry that they may be at the early stages of getting one of these diseases. The last comment that I'll make is that while we have the technology, and that's going to get better and better, we also need to have the will. And that's not simply a matter of pharmaceutical companies being willing to spend the money, diagnostic companies being willing to spend the money, payers being willing to reimburse. It's really a fundamental societal issue that we're talking about. And what it's going to require is leadership, not just from people who have been going through some of these things and are contemplating the possibility of being personally affected, but it's going to require leadership at every level, university presidents, sports teams, politicians, et cetera. And I think that it'll take the leadership of people like everybody in this room putting pressure on all of those constituencies to say, look, this is a problem that we have as a society. We can't let these things happen to our kids. We can't let them happen to our friends, to our brothers, our fathers, et cetera. And so we have to do something about it. Is that going to be easy? No, it's not going to be easy, because many of the sources of these diseases are things that we otherwise hold dear and enjoy, and we all know that. But is it doable? Absolutely, it's doable. I think just to 20, 25 years ago, how cigarette smoking, for example, was handled in our country. And you'd walk into any restaurant, bar, airplane, and people would be smoking all over the place. And now that's become virtually inconceivable, because society has been willing to confront the problem. So I'm very hopeful, and I'm very grateful for all of the commitment that's represented by the people in this room to make this happen.
Thank you very much, Doug. And to get a completely different perspective, we have Jesse Cedarbaum on our panel. Jesse is an internal medicine MD, but he also you are a neurologist. Okay, very good. So we got 2 neurologists. Jesse also works at Biogen, which is most impressive to me and exciting, because Biogen has recently published some data that starts to look like some real encouragement for the first time in a stratified group. And I'd also be interested, Jesse, when you do your introduction, if you could comment on the role of objective tools, because when I was looking at the pharmaceutical industry 5 years ago, there were a lot of Alzheimer's drug discovery programs that were not sustaining themselves, and there was a lot of subjectivity in the end game. And to the extent that you can get more objective measures of whether or not the drug is having the desired effect, I'm curious to learn from you how you see that playing a role in future drug discovery efforts.
Okay, well, thanks. I'm also, as my nature as being someone who does drug development, I kind of got to be the realist. And so I hope in my remarks I'm also going to try to put some context around some of the things that have been said. The first context I want to put around this is that as a neurologist in the pharmaceutical industry for over 25 years, I've had the fortunate opportunity to work on Alzheimer's disease, on Parkinson's disease, and on amyotrophic lateral sclerosis or Lou Gehrig's disease. Quite frankly, I haven't worked in CTE, but it's not something, because it's been under the radar, it's because we're trying to work out the puzzle of how to deal with this epidemic, and the work that Dr. Stern described is quite remarkable, and to think that this has only happened, really the explosion of work that's happened in the last 5-10 years is quite remarkable, and his group and others working with him deserve a lot of credit. Head trauma is not just a problem or repeated head impact of professional football players and boys that play football and do boxing. Just this morning, I was in the elevator over at Biogen across the street. I was riding up with a colleague, and I said, "How was your weekend?" Typical Monday morning chat. And he said, "Well, I spent it in the emergency room with my daughter because she injured herself playing soccer." And I was thinking I was coming over here today. I said, "Well, I hope it wasn't a head injury." And he said, "Well, how'd you know?" Head injury and repeated head impacts happen in virtually all sports. Soccer, it's not just head contact with other players and with the ground. It's the contact with the ball when the ball is headed. And we like to think that helmets provide protection, but they don't. Motorcycle riders, we know when they hit the ground with a plastic helmet, man, what causes the damage in the brain is not so much the impact with the outside. It's the impact of the brain, which is sort of a jelly-like thing encased in a fluid cushion with the inside of the skull. And when the brain hits, it bounces back and forth and back and forth, back and forth, and it tears the wiring, and it damages the cells, and it does all kinds of stuff. And it releases tau and other things into the bloodstream and into the spinal fluid, and hopefully these will give us indices of what's going on. And it's not just the tau that we have to think about. There are other proteins, a myriad of other proteins, not a million, but a myriad of them, that are also released to reflect other aspects of the function of the cell. Tau, the cell tells us a lot about the structure of the axons, which are the long fibrous parts of the neurons that connect one cell in one part of the brain to the other. But there are other elements that help tau do its work in holding cells together. There are proteins that are important in the synapse, like synuclein in Parkinson's disease, like the A-beta protein, which causes pathology in Alzheimer's disease. All these proteins are interacting, and it's really, as Dr. Stern alluded to towards the end of his talk, it's this milieu of proteins. It's going to be the sequence of proteins. If anybody's ever had the misfortune to end up in the hospital as a rule-out for myocardial infarction, you know that what they do is not just one blood test, but it's a series of blood tests. And we used to look at a series of 3 proteins. Now we just look at 2, but we look at them over time, and it's understanding that temporal course, not only associated with the immediate impact, but over years that we're going to have to be working on. So to your question about digital tools. Also this weekend, I was watching my alma mater, Stanford. Here I am with a bunch of Ohio State guys, but I'm a Stanford guy. I didn't play football. You can probably guess that. And probably, yeah, I don't know. I know there are other things I might have done. I can't say I did them, but might have not been so good for my brain when I was in college. But Eric Owusu, one of Stanford's prize corps of wide receivers, went up for a pass, and in comes the UCLA lineman. Their helmets connect. I can't say it was a purposeful hit or not. And at the end, the referees decided it wasn't a deliberate headbutt. But Owusu went down, and he was down on the ground for about 5 minutes. And he finally got up and walked off the field, and they took him to the locker room, and he appeared back on the field after halftime in his civvies, and he didn't play the rest of the game. What happened when he went back to the locker room? They sat him down in front of a computer, and he ran through a standardized series of cognitive tests, which they had done before the season, which they had done before he ever began playing football at Stanford, and they compared him to his own baseline. And the physician, looking at the output of this computerized battery, decided he's not himself, and he's not going back to play. And he's not going back to play next week or the week after until he gets back to his baseline. So we are using digital assessments to assess the risk and the outcome of head trauma. But what these kind of tests aren't telling us right now is what is the cumulative impact. Why did Muhammad Ali, who famously took relatively few hits to the head, end up with what we believe was dementia and pugilistic Parkinsonism? And George Foreman is on TV doing commercials for how to get your intellectual property needs taken care of. Why is that? Did Muhammad Ali have some sort of genetic risk? We didn't talk about what's the genetic risk. Should we be screening people, and I'm sure you are in your program, for their genetic profiles? Maybe there's a pattern of genetic risks also that can help us decide who should be allowed to play for longer or not. The last thing I'd like to say about digital assessments is we can put sensors in the helmets, and we can measure the impact of hits. I don't know if folks are doing that, but that certainly is one way, but you can't put it in the soccer ball unless we have all kids, which I would like to see, doing any sport that requires any contact, wearing helmets, even kids playing soccer. Baseball players, well, now they wear them on the bases too. Pitchers are starting to wear them. You know, I've seen pitchers get beamed. So this is not a unique problem to football. It's not a unique problem to boys. We need to understand the genetics. We can apply digital tools, and we need to understand the context of all these wonderful biomarker tools that Dr. Stern described to us, and be very grateful that the field has made such tremendous progress in the last several years.
Thank you, Jesse. So we'll start off by opening it up to the audience. If there's any questions, Andreas is... Okay.
He's not asking a question.
Andreas, you want to ask a question too? Because I know you had one earlier.
Sure. Is this on? Yes, it is.
Yes.
So I think, common theme here. So we heard the analogy to oncology and AMI, acute myocardial infarction. So maybe start up with one question. I think what we're really missing is a molecular, and that doesn't mean DNA only, it includes RNA and protein definition. Some people call it taxonomy of these diseases to move this forward. I mean, wouldn't we agree that this is in their brain initiatives in a way? I mean, I think this is more intermediate and long term, but maybe we can take comments in this domain first to really understand what we are clinically diagnosing, and then that has a second follow-up question as well.
So the question, again, Andreas, would be just to summarize.
How do we develop a molecular framework for these diseases? I mean, rather defining clinically based on scales, which we know are very subjective and not objective, how do we, Doug commented on this, but how do we do it practically? How do we pull up our sleeves or roll up our sleeves? How do we make the investments? How do we develop this scientifically?
So Bob, you want to?
Yeah, I can start with that. With these diseases that we've been able to diagnose neuropathologically for a long time. Dr. Alzheimer described the plaques and tangles of Alzheimer in the first decade of the 1900s. Now we know what the proteins are. And now where things are going are the omics, trying to understand the proteomics, trying to understand the genomics, trying to understand all of the molecular distinctions between one disease, another disease, one subtype of disease, another subtype of disease. When those things can then be translated into tools that can be used through a blood test, through a digital type of technology, when we can specifically say this picture, this profile of this disease is being seen in this individual through this blood test, that's where I think we're going to make a huge difference. Because like you were saying, you send someone into the locker room and you give them the impact test or cognitive assessment, or you have 10,000 people participate in a phase 3 clinical trial for Alzheimer's disease, and you use these cognitive tools that are, like you said, not that accurate and not able to definitively differentiate between one group and another or the progression of a disease from individual to individual, you need something better. Now, I'm shooting myself in the foot. I'm a neuropsychologist by training who creates a lot of those tests, but they stink. We can't use those things anymore in understanding who should go into a clinical trial and what the ultimate effect of a treatment is. We need to get down, yes, to the molecular level and have a profile of these biomarkers that are based on the omics of that disease.
I would like to get this panel's view on a question, and that is the entrenched way of doing things and the entrenched way and practices that are established sometimes can very much get in the way of a technology making progress. And I went to a conference called Concussion up in Canada, and there were a lot of practicing clinicians in the area of concussion that seemed to have a lot of pent-up resistance to the concept of objective biomarkers. In some ways, I watched this in cancer and heart disease. It takes a while for those that might be making a living out of symptomatic kind of interpretation. So that would be kind of the clinical side of it. There's also profitability, obviously, in the NFL and in a lot of sporting, and there could be things that can get in the way of progress and actually cause you to hesitate as a researcher. And I was curious if any of you have comments to the political pressures that there could be in place for neurology that I think cardiology and oncology have broken through just incredible levels of patient advocacy, where I don't know if you have quite that level of it yet in sport or in a neurology clinical setting. So I was curious if any of you guys have any views around how that could get in the way or what we might be able to do to try to break through it.
So I have a couple thoughts I can share. And they're in entirely different realms. So one, you mentioned the patients and patient advocacy. I spent last week at the World Parkinson Congress in Portland, Oregon, where there were, out of the 4,500 people in attendance, I think 4,000 of them were Parkinson patients or their caregivers. One of the things we need, particularly to develop biomarkers, is we need the participation of the patients because this, like all other neurodegenerative disorders, is a very pleiotropic and pleomorphic disorder. And there's a lot of overlap in the pathology and the proteins that are involved with Parkinson's, with Alzheimer's. These are the same proteins we're talking about in other neurodegenerative diseases. And to understand what differentiates one from the other and to learn what we can from one disease to another requires large pools of patients. We have this in Alzheimer's disease with the Alzheimer's Disease Neuroimaging Initiative, which has enrolled over 1,000 patients in the United States now over the last 10, 15 years. We have the Parkinson Progression Markers Initiative, funded by the Michael J. Fox Foundation, where patients and actually their families are coming together to provide data that can help us. With this, the political, one of the pressures that keeps people away is the stigma of self-identifying as suffering from a condition. And I think perhaps in this area, because it affects cognition, affects people's personalities, it keeps them from volunteering. And so I think one play I would make is we need these kind of organized efforts. We need everybody who suspects that they might be or have a relative who has suffered repeated head trauma to come forward to participate in these kind of studies so that we can gather this data faster. That's the patient message. I think that's a really important one. I said at that meeting, and I'll say it here, I think every patient who walks in a doctor's office should be a participant in a research study. And doctors have a lot of disincentive to do that. They're afraid they're going to lose the income from the patient if they go to a research study, et cetera, et cetera. We got to find ways to deal with that. The other thing is we need to be clear about our communication, what we mean about a biomarker. Biomarkers can be lots of things. There are several different categories of biomarker. A biomarker can be a state biomarker. It can tell you that somebody has the risk or the propensity to develop a condition. That may not be tau. Tau more likely is that's a trait marker. I get myself confused. That's a trait marker. A state marker is how far down on the slippery slope of neurological decline are you? That's where tau and some of these other proteins may come in. Then we have, when we get to drug development, we have pharmacodynamic markers which tell us how our drugs are interacting with the systems of interest. So when we say we're developing a biomarker, we need to be very, very careful and not only discussing among ourselves, but also with the community out there what we mean and what they plan to use them for. Because if we're clear in our communication, that helps build trust. And trust is a really important element here.
If I could add to that, people don't go to the neurologist on their own right away. They go to their primary care physicians. And when it comes to many of these disorders, perhaps not Parkinson's as much as Alzheimer's disease, which is just so unbelievably common now, the typical primary care physician stays away from diagnosing it. The majority of people with Alzheimer's disease dementia aren't diagnosed with it. And that's because there's still this belief that, well, there's nothing that can be done. There's still a belief that it's just part of normal aging. And in order for us to get to the next step, to get those people not just into research, but diagnosed so they understand and their families understand there's something going on, to be able to get to the next step of diagnostics and effective treatment, we need to start with the primary care physicians by giving them something that will help them feel more confident in a diagnosis.
And that's often education.
99% of it's education. And then comes maybe a biomarker that they can say, okay, now I'm going to send them to the specialist.
Mm-hmm.
So Doug, I was going to ask a question in the audience.
Hello. I wonder if any of the panelists is aware, for instance, we're talking here about concussion driven by major of the contact sports that are practiced here, but what happens, for instance, when you compare country to country, that countries in Europe or maybe in Asia don't practice football? Do you see the same prevalence or some of these indication of concussions in the people that practice in their young age?
Have you done any geographic?
Yeah, it depends on whether we're talking about concussion or we're talking about CTE. CTE is just not looked at yet enough. My own personal sense is that we're not going to see it that much outside of boxing and American football. Perhaps soccer. If we do see it, like you were suggesting, from heading, that's going to be a major game changer because the rest of the world, their football is just ubiquitous. And so if heading, as some of our findings do suggest, results in some alterations to the brain and maybe put someone at risk for CTE, we've got a big universal problem. But when it comes to other sports outside of the US and concussion awareness, concussion management, it's been much slower for the awareness to occur, but it's happening now. So across Europe and across Australia, there's a much greater awareness. In terms of counting the concussions or other types of brain trauma from sports, it's just beginning, so we really can't compare culture to culture yet.
I got to mention something that is also not sports related, is that we have millions of people in certain areas of the world that are exposed now to battlefield conditions.
Sure.
In war, in civil strife, with IEDs exploding by roads, with bombs exploding around their homes. And these people, even if they're not hit by debris or hit in the head, they're exposed to concussion waves in the atmosphere, pressure waves in the atmosphere, which also can cause head trauma. So it's not just a sports problem.
And we've found CTE in former military, neuropathologically, people who were exposed to repeated IED blast hits. And a lot of times in military training, there's a lot of repetitive hits to the head. So military is the other, perhaps, even greater immediate need to focus on.
this whole area of comorbidity too, where there's concern, like what really is the issue that you might see in a soldier. That became a pretty big topic at One Mind. You have a lot of different post-stress disorders that they're trying to sort out, and you've got drug addiction, you've got a lot of different complications. And I was really curious if I could get one last view, Doug, from you, unless there's questions.
There's a question here, Doug.
Okay, we'll grab that in a second. Just around $220 million was raised by Denali for an Alzheimer's, and there's clear evidence that we're going to have an unprecedented need for Alzheimer care. But how comfortable are you as an investor with the level of subjectivity versus objectivity on whether or not that drug is in fact going to score a home run or not? How do you make that assessment when you're thinking about raising that level of money?
Well, just to be clear, Denali is not predicated on a drug, so this isn't sort of a bet on whether a compound is going to work. I think that a lot of the discussion that's been going on in the last hour relates to a very simple concept. There's periods where patients' problems are understood at the syndromic level. Meaning that they experience a certain set of dysfunctions. There may be some pathological correlates to that, but there's no understanding of the mechanistic basis. And inevitably, that is a very heterogeneous categorization, and it's very, very hard to develop therapeutics for a syndrome. There's points at which the understanding advances to where patients' dysfunction can be categorized in a meaningful disease way where the mechanistic basis is understood, and where groups of patients have the same disease, they're homogeneous, the course of that disease is relatively predictable, and there's a rational basis for believing if you do X, Y, Z to those people, that it should have a positive impact on their disease. Denali is predicated on our belief that in certain domains, it is now becoming possible to understand some of these neurodegenerative syndromes, which is really what Alzheimer's and Parkinson's and ALS are, as actually groups that comprise different diseases. And that if we can really specify what those diseases are, then we actually have a fighting chance of having an impact on them. So I think that that's a paradigm. When I made the analogy with oncology, which has many shortcomings that shouldn't be taken too far, but I think that that paradigm is starting to emerge in neurology, and that it's going to be the adoption of that paradigm that's really going to change the game.
Excellent.
Good morning, distinguished panel and ladies and gentlemen. My name is Tina Chu. I'm an ophthalmic innovator. Entrepreneur. I have a background in retina specialist and stem cell biologist. Eye is the forefront of the brain in echoing Kevin's early morning spirit of Steve Jobs. Connections, connectivity, creativity is a connection. Over the past 20 or 30 years, ophthalmologists have been benefited from neuroscience research for therapeutic target and diagnostic as well. Well, by you're talking about the toll factor, is the end result, the result of necrosis in the protein, the cell death. Do we have anything earlier? For example, in the eye, we can do pattern ERG and OCT to measure the optic nerve fiber layer during the acute stage, which normally happens within 1 week after the concussion, you can detect it. And also there's a very interesting, that we call heat shock protein, crystalline, has a very strong association with the optic nerve and the ganglion cell death. Those are the activities I wonder if expert panel here on research and drug discovery have identified any connectivities between at the functional level as well as in the molecular level, such as heat shock protein and crystalline in the vitreous as well as in the mid-term and the little longer term of the concussion, you can see the optic nerve damage, the thinning of the nerve before you might be able to detect anything in the brain, the atrophy. And we know in the AMD patient, beta amyloid, we will identify in the drusen, which is somehow linked to Alzheimer's disease. We know that. And the tool was not particular, but beta crystalline is a very, very strong. And also in the retina, ganglion cell has the highest, I believe, the metabolism and the circulation. Well, there's a, talk about the astrocyte in there. There's a transfer between the mitochondria, extracellular mitochondria transfer between astrocyte and ganglion cell, optic ganglion cell. So those are the, I think the dots I try to throw to the panel in the future if we can use the Simona technique to detect anything earlier, more sensitive as an indicator for diagnostic as well as a therapeutic for neuroprotection drugs, where there's a challenge to validate in the clinical setting. And the ocular imaging is going to bring a new forefront of validating the therapeutic target for the brain, where hidden in the brain, which you can't do much in that space, but in the retina you can do much more invasive or minimally invasive withdrawal features, or non-invasive imaging systems can use a very high resolution, precise to a single cell level. So I think those are the area might be, don't know, for the future, if you have anything have already done or being developed, can comment, I would be grateful. Thank you so very much.
Yep, thank you.
Yeah, so, my first wife was an ophthalmologist, and so I was early on taught that the eye is indeed the window to the brain. And we have just been recently using OCT as a potential biomarker or measure of changes in CTE. There have been studies looking at OCT and the counting of ganglion cells, the counting of these very wonderful, minute ability to detect changes in the retinal cell level that have distinguished Alzheimer's disease from controls or from mild cognitive impairment, so levels of the disease, just looking at OCT. We've done a study with looking at retinal blood flow in Alzheimer's disease. With my colleagues over at the Mass General, we were able to see that indeed looking at retinal blood flow is a window into perhaps what's going on in Alzheimer's disease. So using the eye as a potential area of testing and biomarker assessment for a variety of these diseases, I think holds a lot of promise.
Excellent.
It's not really a biomarker, but I will say that we talked a little bit about research being done through the military. What we found is that I was tested for a pituitary gland, and they found that people that have had repetitive head trauma oftentimes have a problem with their pituitary gland. So I was tested for that, and sure enough, my pituitary gland is not secreting any level whatsoever of human growth hormone. So that is just a little bit more of a confirming the fact that I've had the head trauma, and now I'm on a daily dosage of human growth hormone, just to try, not to become a better athlete, that's for sure, but just to kind of get back to where I need to be in terms of what my body would normally produce. So there are a lot of ways to look at whether or not we've had the head trauma.
Excellent. Well, I want to thank this panel, Pete, Tim, Doug, Jesse, Bob. Great opportunity to discuss this.